All right, it looks like it's about 11:05 here in Redmond, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to this research talk. I am Doug Seven. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in just one second. But the intention of this talk is to kick off a series. So my team will be doing a series of talks the first Wednesday of every month related to healthcare data and research. And so we're kicking off this series with a talk about clinical research with an evolving and new standard called FHIR, which we'll be spending some time kind of baselining what FHIR is and why it's relevant in this context, and then talking about how it would tie into clinical research. So think of this as a bit of an introductory talk that will give you the high-level flyover view of how you would work with healthcare data and healthcare standards in clinical research. And then the series of talks that we'll have, different people from the team will come and talk about different capabilities like the Internet of Medical Things and working with connected devices through things like clinical trials and things like that, or the secondary use of clinical data through tools like de-identification, anonymization, and things like that. So that's where we are today and where we're going to be going over the next several months. We'll be sharing things we're working on. So my goal today is to give you that high-level landscape and high-level overview. Let me just quickly tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm the senior director in a team called Health Cloud and Data, which is part of Health Next here in Microsoft Research. The team's been around for a number of years. I've been on this team for about 2.5 years. And our job is to incubate technologies around the healthcare domain, specifically for the purpose of enabling organizations to improve healthcare through things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and analytics and things like that. So a lot of what we do is incubate products and technologies that either ship as individual products or ship as part of other existing products. We'll talk about some of those things. But the idea being that enables this data to come in, this clinical data to come into our cloud environments and be used in these different ways. Personally, I've been at Microsoft for 14 of the last 21 years. I started originally in 1999, but I've left a couple times to do startup work. Most of my career has been dealing with incubations, working in different parts of both Microsoft and outside of Microsoft on new businesses and new products and new technologies and incubation. And like I said, for the last couple of years, I've been here in Microsoft Research as part of the Health Next team working on this technology. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about where we're going, what we're going to do. So my plan for the time we have here today is to first sort of explain the role of FHIR, the FHIR standard in data interoperability, more to set some context for what's happening in healthcare and why this standard is relevant and important in what we're going to be talking about in terms of how you then enable this data to be used in different research projects and research endeavors. And in talking about that, I do want to spend some time talking about FHIR and the fairness principles for data. I think this is relevant. I think this is important. I want to tie into some of the conversation that's happening internally around the fair use of data, particularly in research and AI and things like that. So I just want to anchor the FHIR specification with the fairness principles so you have a good sense of how that applies and why that's relevant. And then we'll spend some time talking about some of the research data flow. And we'll actually talk about a data flow starting with how this data exists in the real world in patient care, and then how you bring it into the environments we have for working with that data, and how you kind of move through these different workflows. And in the process, highlight some of the technologies and some of the things that we've been working on that we'll be talking about over the next few months. And bear in mind that these things are continuously evolving. Our team is continuously working on these things. So what I talk about today conceptually exists in our landscape. But as we progress over the next few months and we introduce some more deep dive conversations, those technologies will evolve and change. So it's a good reason to come back and see the other conversations to know more about what's happening there. Before we end, so FHIR is largely, FHIR is around a standard around clinical data, textual data, medical record data. Before we end, I want to talk about how you would integrate medical imaging data into this. And we have projects that have existed in research for a while around things like InterEye for doing some of the work with medical imaging data. I want to talk about in this context how you would integrate medical imaging data with this clinical data that's coming in FHIR, and then sort of wrap up and give you a little bit of look ahead as to what's coming from our team over the next few months in some of these conversations. So let me start with the role of FHIR and interoperability and talk about kind of what's the state of things and where we're going. So today, and you've probably all experienced this sort of firsthand, anecdotally, data, patient data is sort of trapped in different silos depending on where you go. Either in a clinical space, you go to one provider and they have data, you go to another provider and they have different data or some data. Maybe they're part of a network that shares data, maybe they're not. I was just having a conversation last night with a friend whose data, she's having difficulty getting access to her data from one of the providers because the data is sort of trapped and locked away. And this exists across a collection of systems. So these systems all exist for different purposes, whether it's your electronic medical record that's in a clinical environment, or some imaging data that's part of a radiology scenario, or some of the medication data, or maybe you're part of a clinical trial, or some of the financial data. So this data is all over the place. I won't get into sort of the problems that exist operationally with this in terms of the waste and the cost and things like that, but it's worth noting that from a research perspective, you generally want more of this data. You don't want just one silo of this data. You want more of this data. You want to create a bigger picture of what you're researching. And it's difficult to get. It's difficult because it is in different silos and it's all over the place in different locations. Not only do you have sort of the business aspect of access, do you have privilege and rights to get access to that data, but you have the technical challenge of it's in different places and in different formats and different things. And so what you really need is this data to be connected through some form of interoperability. And the good news is, at least in the United States, and what I'll say is there's legislation happening in the United States that is requiring this data to become more accessible and more available, but that legislation is sort of paving the way for the rest of the world to think about how this data is accessible. And in some cases, other parts of the world are way ahead of the United States in terms of availability and access to this data and the unification of this data. But the idea here is that through an agreed upon set of interoperability rules, all of this data would be available and exchangeable. And those rules are based around a standard for data called FHIR, which we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. This is huge in terms of what it means in the United States for healthcare data in terms of unifying the standard for the data and how it's presented and how it's exchanged, and then ultimately getting access to that data. This is effectively, I always make the analogy that this is very similar. This is for healthcare, this is the equivalent to what USB is for multimedia. The standards for USB, while not legislatively mandated, the standards for USB mean that I can have my laptop and I can plug it into a printer or a webcam or a projector. And it's just going to work because the industry has agreed on a standard for data exchange and data interoperability. And that's effectively what FHIR is for healthcare and clinical scenarios. The challenge, though, is that it's not just about what's in your electronic medical record. So we'll talk about what FHIR does for clinical data, and the fact that these rules that are coming down legislatively mandate that organizations that are custodians of healthcare data, providers, payers, these people, have to make that data available through these standards. There's lots of other data that may not be in those places. Your education data, job status data, health and fitness data, biometrics, things like that. This data is largely relevant in many research scenarios. And in fact, probably some of this is more relevant in many research scenarios than what's in your medical record. Your medical record is only a piece of it. In fact, some of this research shows that it's probably 20 or 30% of your information in your medical record is what's relevant to your total health and well-being. So we do have to think about these other things, and we often sort of lump all these things into the category of social determinants of health or social influencers of health. And it's important to recognize that they play a critical role in what we do. And so we'll talk about what is possible by pulling data from the medical record, but also how can you extend that to include this other data and what you can do with it. So, this talk is about clinical research with FHIR, and I'm going to make the assumption that some people come in knowing what FHIR is, some people come in not knowing what FHIR is and want to know. And by the way, I should have mentioned in the beginning, we have a Q&A panel for the live event. You can't ask questions directly verbally, but you can ask them, or vocally, I should say, but you can ask them through the Q&A panel, and some of my team is there ready to answer questions as well. But FHIR is a standard. It's a piece of paper, effectively. It's a standard created by a set of working groups across the healthcare industry with representation from healthcare payers and providers and pharmaceutical companies and tech companies like ourselves. And it's a standard that's designed to support and enable the exchange of clinical health information, primarily for the benefit of care, but also in support of other scenarios like research and things like that. So when we talk about FHIR, it really is just a specification, much like a Bluetooth or USB. It's just a specification, and then there's an implementation of that specification and what that means. When we talk about FHIR, the idea here is, and this may seem slightly archaic to us at Microsoft because we tend to be, on the leading edge of technology, but healthcare is really on the laggard edge of technology. Healthcare is driven by fear and compliance, and so oftentimes they're the last to adopt technologies. In many cases, there's some cases certainly where healthcare leads the way through research and things like that. But FHIR is really based on a set of widely used best practices that we see across the rest of technological industries. Use of RESTful APIs and schemas and data formats and things like that that are relatively clear in many cases. So there's a bit of education here, but for those of us at Microsoft, we're very familiar with these things, and these things are well proven and easy to implement. The intention of FHIR is to be relatively broad. And so the idea that FHIR has been developing over the last 10 years or so, and it's put together by a set of working groups with all this representation from different places. And so the intent is to think about the wide variety of scenarios in which you would have sort of clinical data and how it would be used, whether it be human, mentions here human or veterinary or other things. Certainly the emphasis in most cases is on human clinical care, but the intent behind the FHIR specification is to be quite broad to support care and point of care. So if I'm a patient, that a provider has access to all of my medical history and medical information through this interoperability standard, they can get that data from wherever it might exist and have it in one place. But also in areas like public health and analytics and how we can look at that data, clinical trials, research, things like that. And so FHIR is defined as a collection of what they call resources. So FHIR stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And the FHIR resources are those entities, those things. A patient is a resource, an observation is a resource, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But it is intended to be quite broad. And I mentioned that it's been developed by this international group. So it's not a US standard. That's probably one of the more important pieces of this. In fact, we're seeing rapid adoption of the FHIR standard outside of the United States. We talk with lots of organizations in the UK, in Africa, in Asia, that are moving toward the adoption of FHIR because of what it's intended to do, which is sort of unify the standard for how this data is represented and exchanged. So again, kind of going back to my USB comparison, the standard for the data exchange is defined by FHIR, the sort of shape of the plug and the what data is on what wire, if you will, from an analogy perspective. But the internal operations of the system are completely orthogonal to the FHIR standard. So in other words, if I can exchange the data in and out of my system according to the FHIR standard, it doesn't matter what happens inside my system. I can do anything I want as long as I can represent that data and receive that data according to the standard. And that's hugely important when we start talking about unifying these different things and getting data from different places. So let me take a second to kind of show you a little bit of what FHIR looks like. So the FHIR standard itself defines, like I mentioned in my analogy, the shape of the plug and the data that goes over the wire. So in other words, what are the APIs? How do I exchange this data? And then when I do exchange the data, what does it look like? What's the shape of that data? And so when we talk about the resources in FHIR, there's about, I think current count is about 140 resources that are defined in the FHIR specification. And they go through a sort of tiering of maturity. So when a new use case is thought of and somebody says, oh, we need to really think about clinical trials and research. So we need to have resource for a research subject. A research subject is something that we will talk about. They're different than specification. And it starts at a maturity level of 0. And then through the working groups and through real world use cases, that resource gets exercised and validated. And then as it gets validated, it moves up in maturity level from a 0 to a 1 to a 2 to a 3, all the way up to the 5th level of maturity, if I recall my maturity levels correctly, which is the normative state, meaning that we've exercised this resource well enough that we understand what it is, and it is likely to not change going forward. We have a good sense of it. There's only about a dozen or so, maybe 2 dozen resources that have reached the normative state. You can imagine what they might be: patient, provider, some of these things that are the most commonly used resources in the specification. Everything else is at varying levels of resource. And in fact, you can go to the FHIR websites. If you go to hl7.org/FHIR, you'll find all the information about the FHIR specification. And there's a resources tab that you can click and see a list of all the resources, and they'll have a little number next to it that shows you what the maturity level is. But the resources are independent. So a patient is a resource all by itself. A procedure is a resource all by itself, and they have relationships with one another. So this isn't a hierarchy necessarily, and it's not even a relational database necessarily, although you certainly could probably represent it that way. But it really is more like a graph of resources and their relationship to one another. So I have an example here on the screen of a procedure. So if a patient's going in for a procedure like I'll be dramatic and say a heart transplant, that procedure is its own resource. That heart transplant procedure is its own resource, and it's an instance of this definition. And it has a relationship to these other things. So that procedure has a subject. The procedure is being performed on a subject, and that subject is the patient. And it's being performed by a practitioner. And it is related to a diagnostic report, a condition, and it is all part of an encounter. And this is just an example that I wanted to show you. But let me also kind of give you a look of what these things really look like. And so this is kind of how FHIR works. If we take a look at how it's represented, we have here just a sample repo. These are synthetically generated patients, so there's no PHI here. These aren't real people. We use the tool to generate a bunch of patients, and we just have a little viewer. This is just a sample app we have to show what this can be. And so let me refresh and make sure I'm logged in and loaded up. So I've got a bunch of patients here, and if I look at this, I've got a 65-year-old patient named IRA784. And I can click on this little FHIR icon, and what I see here is this is the actual FHIR resource. And I'm going to point out a few things that are relevant as we proceed through the rest of the conversation. This is important stuff. So there's a unique URL associated with this. So it's my FHIR server /patient and then /this ID. You can see here, there's the ID of the patient. So this is a resource type defined as patient. You might have a resource type of observation. You might have an encounter, so on and so forth. And this resource, this particular resource has a unique and durable ID. This has nothing to do with the medical record. This has nothing to do with anything else. This is generated for and by the FHIR server instance, and it's a unique and durable ID. So anytime I make a request for this ID, I will get this patient. And that's really important when we talk about the sort of reusability of data and some of the FHIR principles. As we look at this, there's a few other things of note here. There's something called an extension. And in this case, an extension is a way in which you can modify the resource. So the resource has a definition, and you might want to extend that definition with some other information. So I can add, in this case, I'm adding a mother's maiden name and a birthplace as an extension to this patient. So it's not part of the official specification, but by adding an extension, I can extend the definition of patient without breaking the definition according to the specification. This is one of the values of FHIR. And when we think about things like social determinants of health, and I want to add data that's not historically part of a medical record, The extensions really give me the opportunity to do that. So I have something called a structured definition, which is sort of the base object, if you will, for FHIR data. And from that structured definition, I can define new data types that I want to work with and what's included in them. So you can see a mother's maiden name has a value string, a birthplace has an address, and an address is a type. And so I have a lot of flexibility with what I can do here and how I can extend this data. Furthermore, I have different things like here I have an identifier. It's part of a coding system. The coding system is a well-defined and well-known coding system. And in this case, I'm dealing with a medical record number. And the medical record number is associated to a system and it has a value. And so same with social security number. I have a well-defined code system for this. Social security number is well-defined and it's published. So the key here is, as we think about the fairness principles as we come into this later, is some of these things are really important. The reusable and durable ID, the extensibility of this, and the known code systems and things that I can work against and understand. So these are open standards and well-known and well-published. And so you can see this is sort of an example of a patient. There's various attributes of a patient like marital status and so on and so forth. If I leave my patient, I can also go in and look at what a patient looks like. And here I can see that I have conditions, encounters, observations. These are all other resources that are related to this patient. So in other words, if I look at a particular condition, so there's a cardiac arrest condition, so it's a resource type condition, it too has a unique and durable identifier, and it has a clinical status, which is a condition. And if I look at this, I can see that it's got, works with a known terminology for defining what it is. But more importantly, what I want to point out is it has something called a subject, and that subject is that patient, durable patient ID we talked about before. It also has something called an encounter. And in this case, an encounter is some point at which that patient and a provider came into contact with one another, and that created an encounter. And that encounter then consumes a number of other things. So if I look at this cardiac arrest encounter, it'll tell me what it is. In this case, it's an emergency encounter. It's for this particular patient. When did that encounter start and end? Who was the service provider? So on and so forth. Through all of this, it's important to note that we also see version IDs. So every resource we looked at had a version ID, which means that I can version these resources. So if I go back to my patient, I think this is a version 1 patient, but I can see that I've got my ID, I've got my person, and I've got a version, so I'm version 1 patient. But if I update something about that patient, let's say their name changes, something changes, I can then go to a version 2 of that patient. And so I can always go back and look at all the versions that exist within the system. So that's just kind of a quick tour of how FHIR looks and what it looks like. So like I mentioned, there's about 140 or so different resource definitions for different things, but they all basically work the same way, which is you have this sort of identity and versioning system. So up here we see at the top, on the example below, we saw the version down at the bottom, but it has a type and it has a durable ID, it has a version, it has a last updated date. We have this concept of an extension, so we can extend these resources to include data that is relevant to our use case and what we're doing if we need to. And then we have a bunch of standard data that is dependent on that particular resource. So in this case, a patient has, for example, a medical record number, a name, a gender, a birth date, so on and so forth. A research subject would have things like consent, what's the patient ID associated with that research subject, and so on and so forth. So there's different capabilities that are used there. So this sort of then bridges us into this concept of the principles, the fairness principles for data. And the fairness principles for data, of course, are the findability of the data, the accessibility of the data, the interoperability of the data, and the reusability of the data. And so let's talk about those for a second. So what I want to do is talk about these principles, and I want to connect these principles to the FHIR specification and why this is so relevant and why this is so important. When the working groups come together to think about how to implement FHIR, these concepts are also top of mind. While they're thinking about how do we support the exchange of data for care and for payment and things like that, they're also thinking about how do we ensure that this data can be used in a variety of scenarios, including research. So the FAIR principles are pretty important in how we think about this. So if we think about Findable, And I'm not going to go through everything here, but I just want to kind of point out that some of the key principles behind this is that you have to be able to find the data. It has to be reliably findable. In other words, you have to have a global, unique, and durable identifier, which we talked about. Every resource in FHIR has that. You have the metadata that describes it. These things are available. And the fourth note here, registered or indexed and in a searchable resource, is key. So FHIR, part of the FHIR specification is not only the sort of CRUD operations, if you will, of how do I create a new resource, how do I retrieve that resource, how do I update or delete that resource, but also how do I search for the resources that matter to me? So how do I, for example, how do I find the cohort that I want to do my research on? And so these resources that are defined in FHIR are all also defined as having searchable attributes. So I can go in and search for the things I care about and get that data back out. And that's one of the key values here as we think about some of the research scenarios is as I bring this data into my environment that I'm going to be working on, how do I then find the parts of the data that I care about and do different things? And there's some things that are built into FHIR. So the search capabilities that are built into FHIR. So I could say, I want to find, patients with an encounter in a certain time window or something like that. But also the ability to connect that data into other systems that provide different and maybe more flexible ways of doing things. So for example, we have a customer who has brought data into FHIR and then connected it to Azure Search to enable different ways of doing search. We've connected FHIR to Power BI to enable you to sort of visually filter through data in Power BI. So there's some different options there. Accessible is the next principle and how it's there. And again, we're starting to see some sort of a repeat of some of the things I pointed out intentionally while we were looking at the FHIR examples in terms of how I can retrieve a resource by its ID using standard protocol, RESTful APIs, things like that. This is open, freely, and universally implementable. Anybody can implement this. All we have done, by the way, we have built a FHIR server for Azure. All we have done is implement the standard as it's written. So we haven't really done anything super secret. We've built some tooling to make it work well, but the implementation of the API is according to the specification. So we're adhering to these standards for the protocol being open, freely, and universally implementable. And we've also supported the authentication authorization rules. In this case, the FHIR principles state where necessary. In this case, we're dealing with some of the most sensitive data that you could have, protected health information, the information about my personal health and well-being, whatever it might include. And so authentication authorization are critical. We've done a couple of things. One thing we did is we've released an implementation of the FHIR standard as an open source project on GitHub called the FHIR server for Azure. And I'll have links to this at the end. And that enables anybody to stand up a FHIR server in Azure in their own Azure subscription. And you have the ability to control some of the authentication and authorization around it. In other words, you could make it anonymously accessible if you want, although we don't recommend that because of the kind of data you're dealing with. When we run it as an Azure service, we also have something called the Azure API for FHIR. We mandate that you must use Azure Active Directory for authentication because we do not believe that anybody should ever create an instance of a FHIR service, a service intended solely for the purpose of holding clinical data and not have it securely locked down. So authentication and authorization are key here. And over time, we're working on resources for how you can finally control access. So the authentication and authorization could actually be controlled down to the individual resource where necessary. In terms of interoperable, this is sort of a given. This is exactly what FHIR is about. The purpose of FHIR is to create interoperable data. And so we really have a published standard that's broadly accepted by the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry. And that data can then be exchanged according to that using common vocabularies, using common terminology systems, and well described and linked data is key. So I don't need to spend a lot of time here because this is the fundamental purpose behind the FHIR specification. And then lastly, reusable, I think this is key. And some of this comes down to the implementation. And I just noticed I forgot a closing parenthesis at the end of my last bullet there. I apologize for that. But the goal of FHIR, of course, is to optimize the reuse of data. And in this case, largely that's what we think about when we think about these capabilities we're building. And as you think about research work, I was having a conversation with Eric Horvitz the other day, and he said this so perfectly in that you have all this data in these systems of truth, right? The electronic medical record, the PAC system with your DICOM data, maybe you're connected to some IoT system for fitness data, maybe it's your billing data, whatever. All these systems of truth have this data. And the goal is not to replace those systems or move that data, but what we're doing is we're creating a digital reflection of that data in the cloud. I credit Eric with those words. This digital reflection of the data in the cloud that enables us to then start to do something really interesting with that data. And so as we talk about the reusability of data, that's really what this is taking all this data, it's all these disparate locations, and maybe even integrating data that you wouldn't typically associate with health, like census data or education data that might be, again, some of those social determinants. And you bring that in and you format it in the correct way. And now you've got this digital reflection of all of this data that is reusable across a wide variety of scenarios. Now, the key, of course, as we think about some of these research scenarios and some of the work we're doing here at Microsoft to think about data and research is, how do we then create this digital reflection in a way that's accessible to all the people who need access to it, that it's reusable so we're not recreating this data all the time, that it's well described and well documented. So as we think about some of these tools that we're building for digital research, part of what we want to think about is how do we associate the metadata around this to describe what this data is so that it's searchable and discoverable as a data set, not as individual data. To say, okay, well, I'm looking for, I'm really interested in finding data around a particular health scenario that I want to do research on. How do I find that data within a particular environment, whether it's within Microsoft or within a health organization? So the reusability of data is kind of built into what we do here, but there's certainly work we can do around it to describe the data and make it more discoverable from a reusability standpoint. One of the key bullets here at the very end of this is meets domain relevant community standards. Now, again, FHIR is exclusively about clinical health data. And in such, there's really strict rules for how we work with this because of the sensitivity of this data. In the United States, HIPAA is the dominant rule. The healthcare interoperability and portability rules, privacy rules associated with HIPAA. The key here is we have to be diligent and we have to be serious about our approach to the security, safety, and privacy of this data. It is paramount. Nothing we do can compromise that. In the systems that we've been building to support bringing this clinical data into Azure and into environments in which we can do research on it. So if you're partnered with a health organization, you're bringing their data into our cloud. One is you can sort of check the box that the services we're building for healthcare data, the Azure API for FHIR and the associated services around it, are designed from the very beginning to meet the requirements for protected health information globally, not just in the United States. So everywhere we deploy into an Azure region, we've met the rules for that area, that region. So HIPAA rules are sort of the min bar for us. We have high trust certification, FedRAMP certification, things like that. So I'll talk about that I'll dig into a little bit of what we've actually built before we get done. But know that that's there, that's important, that's extremely relevant. The last thing we want to be doing is catching, clinical health data from our customers in Excel files that we're storing, in who knows where, but actually having that data in a place that's meant for it that can be used in a meaningful way. And so that's sort of the relationship between the FHIR principles and FHIR, and I'm sure there's some review there for people and some not, but I think it's irrelevant. Now, when we talk about how do we then start to apply this data in clinical research scenarios, what can we do with this data? So I mentioned, sort of having all these sources of truth or data generating environments, the electronic health record, the imaging environments, the IoT, the billing finance, all these things. These are all those silos I talked about in the beginning. They're all in different places. Sure, in time, the hope is that the industry starts to unify and those things can be represented in a much more cohesive way. But for now, that's our job. We're working to enable all of the data from these different environments to be brought into our environment, sort of this ingest and enrich process in which we create that digital reflection of all this data. We persist that digital reflection, and then we enable the access to find within that data set what is relevant and what you need for what you're doing, and then connect it to these systems of intelligence to do whatever that research work is that you're doing. And then how you want to represent that, if you want to represent it in some kind of system of engagement over on the right, there's the tools to do that. There's lots of ways that can be enabled. And in fact, you may have heard of some of the things that we're pushing out for our customers in terms of the Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare and what we're doing with Dynamics and Teams. All of these things are designed to work together. So I want to kind of walk through this flow a little bit and talk first about what we've built and what we're doing. And let me actually come back to this slide. I want to hop a little bit out of order. I had a slide that I wanted to share before. Well, let me just stay on the path I'm on. We'll talk about it in a second. So ingest and enrich, different ways to get data in. The three things I want to talk about, well, four things I want to talk about. One is the direct route. I can get data. If it's in FHIR format, I've got a way to persist it. I can kind of skip past some of this and just pull the data in. But if data is coming from different places, then there's different things I might want to do with it. And I've highlighted three things. One is device data. So data coming from whether it's a wearable or an in-facility device like a hospital bed or something like that. If you're doing research that is dependent upon these connected devices that are sending real-time or relative real-time data, maybe daily snapshots or something like that, you need to connect this sort of what we call the IOMT data, the Internet of Medical Things data. We've built an IOMT connector that will basically, in a nutshell, collect that data in its telemetry stream and then transform show you a couple of screenshots of how some of these things work and work through this flow. The FHIR Converter, this is a UI that's more of a dev test utility that we built, but we have a FHIR Converter, which can run as an API, where you can pass in a message. Here you see in the top panel, a traditional HL7v2 message, which are often very difficult to work with. They're highly customized and you sort of need a decoder ring to understand them. You can build a template, and we have some default templates, which you see in the lower left here, a template that basically parses through that HL7v2 message and then transforms it into a FHIR, what's called a FHIR bundle or a collection of FHIR resources. And so this tool is just one example of how you could convert HL7v2 or CEDA documents to FHIR. So it gives you the ability to collect this data, even if it's not in FHIR. Collect this data, transform it to FHIR, and bring it into our system. The other one is the text analytics for health. And like I mentioned, this is an extension of the cognitive services capabilities where the text analytics has been trained on the healthcare domain. And so you can identify, do classification on clinical notes, for example. Lots of valuable data is often for research in the clinical notes, and somebody has to sit there and read through them and pull out the interesting data. In this case, you can classify data that's in clinical notes as medical data, and then you could then actually turn it into FHIR resources. There's been some internal demos on how we could turn these into FHIR resources and put them in the FHIR system. It's not part of the tool today, but you could imagine how you could easily get from one to the other when you have things like a medication or a diagnosis or a symptom, or some of these things could easily translate into FHIR resources. The next thing I want to talk about is sort of this persistence, and this is where I was thinking about maybe going out of order a little bit. Is what I want to share is the two things that we built. The first of which is what we call the Azure API for FHIR. And API is a little bit of a misnomer here because it's not just an API, it's actually a data management system. So we've wrapped up some data tools for persisting and managing this data and exposed it through an API that adheres to the FHIR specification. So we sort of leveraged the FHIR specification. We wrapped all the management of that data up in a compliance boundary, which is really important. So If you're dealing with clinical data, the min bar of having to meet the HIPAA compliance rules, but even more so if you're starting to work with data that's government in nature, the FedRAMP certifications, if you're dealing with European data, the GDPR rules, all of these things have been taken care of and built into the system. So the idea is that we've leveraged these standards, we've taken care of the compliance and management in this environment, and then we enable you to connect that data to all these other systems of intelligence and systems of engagement for what you're going to do with it and where you want to go. Currently today, we have in Azure, the Azure API for FHIR. It includes the ability to deploy an IoT connector, which is currently in public preview state, but you can deploy an IoT connector so you can connect those devices up and have that data go right into the API for FHIR. Some of these other tools like the FHIR connector and some of the other things I'm going to talk about are coming. They're currently open source projects. We typically release things as open source, and then we bring them into the managed service as we go. And one of the things you saw on the last slide that I mentioned was this medical imaging server for DICOM. I'm going to come around to this at the end and talk about it, but I just want to mention it as another persistence tool here. So we can bring clinical data into the API for FHIR, and we can bring imaging data into the medical imaging server for DICOM, which I'll come back around to. Next, I want to talk about sort of how you get data out. So once I've collected this data, and essentially I've unified, I've created this longitudinal view of data across a wide selection of systems. So I've collected EHR data, IoT data, whatever. And now I've got this longitudinal view. So for a patient, I can see much more than I could see before. Now I need to find what I really want for my research. And so FHIR, as I mentioned, enables different search tools to say, I want to find this. But when we start talking about research, there's really strict rules around how this data gets used in research, and particularly what is considered secondary use. And Ram Vijay Kumar is going to do a session on secondary use and de-identification in December, I believe. But this is critical. There's rules around what can be done with this data and how it can be viewed. And what we've started to do is build a set of tools that put some flexibility in your hands. So if you're doing research, the first step is you just redact anything that's identifiable, but oftentimes that renders the data to a state that it's not particularly useful for research. And so what we are trying to do is build a set of tools that put the knobs and dials in your hand to say, okay, well, I need to properly de-identify this data for privacy adherence, but I still want some data here that I can work with. And so, for instance, I can't include a date, like an admission date, is considered potentially identifiable information. Because if I know that somebody went to a hospital at a particular time, once I can find that date and time, then I can find everything else associated with it, and I can find all of their medical data. And so a date is considered identifiable. And so instead of redacting the date, you might still need dates to build a view of time spans and things that happen and things like that in your machine learning. And so we can do things like date shifting. We can apply a random seed and shift dates back and forth. So you can still maintain some of the validity of the date data, even though it's no longer 100% accurate. You might still be, you can shift the dates accordingly and do things like that. And that is part of a project called the FHIR Tools for Anonymization, and we're bringing those capabilities into the Azure API for FHIR. So they're built right in. So I can say, I want to search for a cohort. I want to export that data as JSON data that I want to then pull into something like Azure Synapse or some of these other tools. But as I'm exporting it, I want it de-identified. And here's the rules for how I want that data de-identified. And so when we look at the de-identification rules, we have different ways of identifying things. So you can see the number one here, if the node is an address type, addresses are identifiable. If I know where you live, I know who you are, I can find everything else about you. But country, state are considered general enough that you can keep them. So I can say, down below, I'm going to redact addresses, but I've added a rule here that says I want to keep the country and the state. So I can choose to override some of these rules. I can also choose to do different things beyond redact. So in this case, for the IDs, I'm doing a crypto hash on the IDs rather than redacting them. I can also choose to redact them, which is the default rule. If it's identifiable, just get rid of it. Or I can do things like date shift. And I mentioned date shift, and here you can see that for dates, we've said date shift, and down below you can see the date shift scope is for the folder. So we've said everything in this set, I want to date shift the same way. So I don't want to accidentally make the admit and discharge dates shift apart or together. I want to shift them the same way, but I'm going to randomly shift them so they're not the correct dates. And then I can also do things like maintain or redact key data. So zip codes are a great one in the United States, where generally you can provide some value of some amount of a zip code to say something because there's enough population in a particular zip code to keep it from being identifiable. But in some zip codes in the United States, the population is so small that it's considered identifiable. And so you have to identify those zip codes and redact them completely. And so what you end up with is, and here's just a screenshot of what it would look like in VS Code, is on the left-hand side, this is a patient resource. And so you can see we have things like gender, birth date, deceased time. This is a patient who's unfortunately passed away, but we're doing research. There's some extensions for latitude, longitude of where this patient is. We have city, state, all these things. And then we have our de-identification rules, which are similar to the ones I just showed you on screen. So when we process all of these FHIR resources against these rules, which is a utility you can run either as part of a Azure Data Factory workflow, or you can run it, if you're doing some dev test work, you can run it locally to make sure it's working the way you want. The end result is that things get taken out. So gender is considered not identifiable. We can keep that. But here you can see the date shift that we applied to the birth date. So the birth date is still there, but it's been shifted randomly, as has the deceased time been shifted randomly. And you can see like the address is considered identifiable. So that was removed, or at least reduced down to the state, postal code, and country. And the postal code was even reduced down to just the first 2 digits. And so this is how some of these de-identification tools can work. You'll still be able to preserve the data. The rules for how you would de-identify the data remain in your hands. And then lastly, I want to talk, and we only have a few minutes left, I want to talk about these systems, or how we connect into different systems of intelligence. We have a couple things. There's a few ways to think about this. There's a little bit of some assembly required. So I could do things like export data, de-identify it, and what I get is a bunch of what are called ND-JSON files that are put into a storage account. So new line delimited JSON files, where each line is a different FHIR resource, dumped into a storage account, and then I can take those ND-JSON files and I can bring them into tools like Azure Synapse. So okay, I've got JSON data. I'm going to go ahead and use the sort of SQL on demand capabilities of Azure Synapse, and I'm going to pull that JSON data in, and now I can work with it in Synapse. Or I can pull it into Databricks, and I can create temporary tables out of the JSON data, join those tables together, and then create a new view of that data, a tabular view of that data that's appropriate for machine learning or for analytics, where I might be joining different parts of that data together. So I can shape the data however I want with this sort of some assembly required. And then we've also built some tools to sort of connect the data automatically to some tools that you might want to use. So the Power BI FHIR connector is one of those, where we've actually, it's already available in Power BI. Power BI has the option to choose FHIR as a data source, and you point it at your FHIR service, you authenticate against it. We interrogate what's called the capability statement. So the capability statement for a FHIR service just specifies what that particular FHIR service is capable of doing. So I can choose, much like any other standard, I can choose my implementation. And so in this case, you can see I've got different resources. So if I scroll through, you can see there's lots of different resources here and all the things associated with them. So an adverse event, for example, is a resource. I may choose to include that or not include that in my implementation of FHIR. Now for the FHIR server that we have in Azure, we have them all supported. And so we just interrogate that capability statement, say what data is available from this FHIR server, and then let's represent that in Power BI and give you the ability to sort of visualize that data in a variety of different ways. And we're doing something similar right now with the Common Data Service to support Dynamics to build a sync agent that works in a similar kind of way that enables data to come out of the FHIR service and be represented in the Common Data Service, and also send updates back into the FHIR service as well, so that we can start to work with all these different tools together in different meaningful ways. And then lastly, we're really close to time here, and I want to make sure I don't leave this out. We've been working feverishly for the last couple of years to support the use of clinical data in things like machine learning and AI and analytics by building this FHIR server, by essentially making the Microsoft portfolio of products understand the language of healthcare through the implementation of the FHIR standard. So Azure understands FHIR through the Azure API for FHIR. Teams understands FHIR through the integration of the FHIR API into Teams. And Dynamics now, through this CDS capability, is understanding the language of healthcare through the FHIR standard. So we've agreed as a company to go forward and meet the healthcare industry where they are by implementing their standard. But then internally, there are times where we have to transform that data into our standards, like the Common Data Service. That's great for clinical data. And along the way, some of the very first questions we got asked by some of our customers were, what about all of my imaging data? I have all the medical record data, it's great, but I have all this imaging data and I want to do work on that as well. And so we recently announced another open source project called the Imaging Server for DICOM that runs in Azure. So this is similar to the FHIR service, but this is designed around imaging data. So I can deploy this into my Azure environment, and I have then a set of APIs that adhere to the DICOM standard. I can bring DICOM image studies into my environment, and I can work with them. I can do some of that work, and I can even tie into other things like Project Interi and some of this other stuff. It's a standards-based imaging server. We've done something we think is unique here, and I think this also was triggered. The reasons for doing this were triggered by some of these research scenarios and some of the first customers we talked to and what they wanted to do in research. And we've called this DICOMcast. And what this does is it connects the medical imaging server and the FHIR server for clinical data together so you can represent the data in one place, which means some of the queries you might want to do looking for cohorts you might be interested in are only possible when you bring this data together. And so what we've done is we enable the imaging data to come into the DICOM server through the DICOM standards, and that goes in. And as data comes in, there's a change feed, and we can monitor that change feed and look for things that happen. And when there's a change, we can grab those DICOM instances that change, and we can find the corresponding FHIR resources that we might have, so a patient or an image study that might exist in FHIR. And we can merge those things together so that all of the metadata from the DICOM instance that we have in the DICOM server is represented in the FHIR server. So when you're searching for those cohorts, you can start to search across not just the clinical medical record data, but also the DICOM image study metadata. This is tremendously important. And some of the stuff that we heard from customers very early on of like, literally they gave us examples of queries they'd want to be able to do for the purposes of research. And it sort of led us to creating this, and it was sort of necessary. So this integration of medical imaging data is something we're continuing to push. And so while we have this as an open source project today, by the end of the fiscal year, you'll see this integrated into the Azure environment as well. So as you're doing your research projects, you should have all of these tools at your disposal to bring this data in and start to work with it in really meaningful ways. So as we sort of wrap up here, we're kind of getting to the end of time. I just want to kind of stress a few things. FHIR is, if not already, it's at least becoming the de facto protocol for clinical data interoperability. This is happening in the US through legislation, and it's happening across the globe sort of because it's a good idea, right? People are implementing this because it's the right thing to do. And we're seeing some really interesting implementations globally around what's happening here. So starting to think about your clinical research according to the FHIR standard is a great way to approach this. It's only going to make things easier as we progress. The benefit here is, as I spent some time on, FHIR aligns with the FAIR data principles. So we're not doing something that we don't believe in. We believe very deeply in the FAIR data principles, and FHIR aligns very well with those, which is fantastic news. And then as I kind of talked about the different tools and capabilities we have in our FHIR technologies to support the work you have to do through this ingest, persist, query, and intelligence pipeline, and the integration of the medical imaging data with that will become sort of an inherent part of this entire flow and entire process of what we do. I'm going to point out some things you can do and things you can try. So we have a bunch of different services. So the first one is the actual service in Azure that you can go deploy this in your Azure subscription just with a few clicks. But we also have a sample sandbox. In fact, the sample app that I was showing you is part of that FHIR server samples. So you can easily deploy a very small but complete environment into your Azure subscription to play with. And there's actually an option to deploy some analytics as well using Databricks, and showing you kind of how you would work with this data using Databricks. We recently released the imaging server for DICOM, so that's available as well. And we'll have some samples for that coming soon also, but there's information on how to use the DICOMcast capability there to merge your imaging data and clinical data. The IoT FHIR connector I mentioned is in public preview and built into the Azure API for FHIR, but it is also an open source project in GitHub, so you can go take a look at it there, but it's really easy to use within the context of the API for FHIR. The FHIR Converter is also there, the FHIR tools for anonymization also there. We'll have future talks on both of these to show you how you use them, what you would do with them, why they're useful. And then the Power BI FHIR connector that I mentioned is already built into Power BI. So if you're using Power BI to do some data visualization, it's already built in. You can use it immediately. We have a couple of other talks coming up. One on the Internet of Medical Things. Titles are TBD at the moment, but next month we'll have a talk on the Internet of Medical Things from Dustin and Nate, part of our IO&T team. This is really fantastic stuff that is worth taking a look at and seeing how it works. And then I mentioned in December, Rami J will be doing a session on de-identification, secondary use, and some of the things you can do with those tools, which will be really relevant in some of these research scenarios. And then January, February, we'll probably do a session on the medical imaging and what can be done with medical imaging, and even look at maybe how it ties into things like Project Interoperability. So how do you use the DICOM service, but then also how do you connect to some of these research tools and some of these other things. And so with that, we are literally right at time. Couldn't have timed it better if I tried. I want to thank everybody for joining. I look forward to seeing you in these future talks. I recognize this was sort of a high-level view and a flyover that was by design to set up kind of what you'll be seeing in these future talks and make sure everybody's sort of baselined on that same landscape. Hopefully the questions have been getting answered in the Q&A environment. If not, certainly reach out to us. We have Teams channels we can add you to if you have questions and get you connected directly to the team. So with that, thank you very much.